Oh, okay, wow. Okay, so this is a talk which is it's a 1 hour lecture, and I think the next lecture will be by Fernando. So over the last 5 years or so, I've been doing a lot of work on um, sort of, you could call it conflict in networks, but it's broadly about the following kind of a problem where you have a network which is um, there's a network and there are processes taking place on the network. And today, and you want to control that process either through blocking this process from spreading or by reconfiguring the network in a way in combination with the blockages so as to minimize the damage. Okay, so that's at a high level, that's been the set of issues. And you can see that you can have applications. Um, and, and actually, let me take a step back. So there are also applications where you are just interested in resilience of a network in the simple sense that nodes of the network might get knocked out. And you want to make sure that when nodes are knocked out, the residual network is functional somehow. You want to design the network, or you want to protect the network in such a way as to keep, crudely speaking, maximal connectivity in the network. Okay. So broadly, one could think of this. There are many applications, and I don't know if the slides will have those. No, they don't have them here. But and so, given that we have 1 hour, what I'll do is instead of talking at a general level, I will actually walk you through two very different kinds of models, which give you some idea about how to, how one might think about these kinds of questions. Okay, so the background here is that there is a lot of interest in network resilience. So this slide is mostly about infrastructure networks, but Fernando and others have done a lot of work on financial networks, and one could think about financial networks also. There's a network of interconnections between banks, and some banks got knocked out, and that has spill-on effects onto other banks, and that there may be a contagion, and you want to control that contagion. So which banks do you want to protect, and which banks do you want to let fail? Okay, so that's the key nodes problem. Okay, and I will do it in a slightly different. The model will not have a natural finance interpretation, but and in particular, I will be looking at a setting where there is an intelligent adversary. Okay, there's going to be an enemy. There's going to be a hacker. There's going to be, sometimes it could be nature, but by and large, I'll be looking at an intelligent adversary. And the adversary is going to try and damage this network. And there is a defender or designer who wants to protect the network. And so we can ask what nodes to attack, but also which nodes to protect. Okay, so that's going to be the first part. And it is actually a fairly, I would say, it's a very rich and general problem in networks, and we will see that it's also, comes up very naturally in these problems. Then, of course, in the basic setting, there will be just two players. One defending the network and the other attacking the network. But one could easily see, for instance, if you're interested in cybersecurity, security choices are made by people who own computers, who own systems, and so security is decentralized. It's not up to one single person, but it's lots and lots, millions of people who are choosing security. And more generally, if you think of airports, they choose security. And different airports choose security typically on their own. If you're in different countries, there is no international agency which chooses security in each of these airports. But there are spillovers. If I choose a high security and you choose a low security, maybe my airport will be compromised because you have low security. Okay, so those kinds of issues are very important in cyber, in computer networks, but also in other infrastructure networks. So you may want to ask, supposing security is decentralized, what kinds of networks do you want to have? And of course, even more generally, networks themselves are often chosen by people. So the simplest example of that would be epidemiology, where people choose who to interact with, and they also choose how much to protect themselves. And you may want to ask what sorts of externalities, what kinds of incentives or behavior will you expect, and then you can start asking questions about where you should intervene. Okay, so there are all those sort of, very wide variety of questions, and I wanted to give you a flavor of how one can think about some of these questions systematically, and so I'm going to talk about two very relatively different kinds of models. Okay. So there's a set of papers in the background, and I won't have time to talk about all of them, but these slides are probably now on the Newton Institute website, and do feel free to write to me if you want more up to date. Okay, so here's the simplest. This is going to be a very, very simple model. There's a network that's given. Think of it as a very bulky infrastructure network, and you could think of the London Underground, for example. And I will talk about the London Underground. Actually, I will show you some data on the London Underground. So you have the London Underground, and you know that in fact it's known that it's been attacked by people, and it could be attacked again. It could, of course, also be attacked by nature. There could be floods, there could be breakdowns in electricity, etc. Okay, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to ask, well, given that you have limited resources, which metro station should you protect? Where should you target your efforts? Okay, and similarly, if there's an adversary, the adversary wants to create the maximum disruption of the network. Well, which underground stations should the adversary target? Okay, so that's the problem. And I'm going to take a very, very simple approach to this. So I will say that you can defend a node. If you defend a node, it's costly, but if you defend it, it's basically the defense is perfectly reliable. Okay, so you can't eliminate a defended node. The adversary attacks and eliminates nodes that are undefended, and at the end you get a residual network, and the value of this network depends on the, and I'll talk about the value function of a network, and so we want to maximize maximize the value of the residual network. That's the goal. And I will talk mostly about an intelligent adversary, but you could also think of this as a maximum problem. So you don't know where the attack is coming from, and you want to look at the worst case scenario. So both are, they have the same mathematical structure.
So we should think of the attackers coming from outside the network?
Yes, in this setting.
Okay.
Yes.
I think a lot of financial networks, the people who have an incentive for one node to fail are people at other nodes.
That's right. So that's another setting, and time permitting, I'll talk about conflict within a network. Okay, but let me get on with this, and that's another set of some of the work I'm doing, but also it's another set of the literature, part of the literature. Okay, so here's a bit of notation. There's a set of nodes N. This is an undirected network, and phi is the value function. Defender chooses a node set of nodes delta to defend. Adversary observes the nodes defended, and then chooses a set of nodes X to attack. And so the defense and the attack jointly define this residual network. Okay. When a node is knocked out, all its connections are knocked out also. It basically it's captured, and you can't use it. So yes, the payoffs. So this is the payoff for the designer. It's the value of the residual network less the costs of defense. It's very simple linear model. Many of the things here carry over to convex costs, but it's useful just to start with this simple. Then you have the payoff of the adversary. The adversary really wants to create maximum damage, but it's costly to attack the network. Okay, so that's the setting. So the key is the value function. Okay, and essentially I'm going to start with a very simple case, just to build some intuition, but more also by way of getting across some key ideas about this problem. So I'm going to look at the case where the network has value only if it is connected. Okay, so it's going to be, it'll have no value if you have two disconnected components. So it's an extreme case. Later, yeah.
So you're formulating the situation as a zero-sum game. Are there?
It's not quite a zero-sum game, but
Why do you know? Yeah, what is the?
because of these costs.
Because of these costs.
Yeah, but
Okay. I see. I was wondering whether there could be interesting situations. I would say yes, in which there is conflict but not opposing interests.
sure, yes. You can have a situation where I really want to protect something and you really want to attack something else, for example. Yes, that's right. Here, this is, it's sort of diametrically opposite. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, yes, clearly. Yeah. So I'm not going to cover that, but yes, you can, you can certainly have that. Yeah. So later on, I will talk about something which we'll come back to this issue. Okay, so I'll come back to, I think, issues relating to this later.
So are they simultaneous moves, or does
Sequential.
the protector goes first?
Yes,
Then the other agent knows what's protected?
that's right. Yeah. Okay, so in this simple setting where you only care about the connectivity of the network, and you will see it's a little artificial, but let's just for 2 minutes just focus our minds on that case. So now I will only attack the network if I'm going to get something out of it, and I'll only get something out of it if I disconnect the network. Otherwise, I don't get anything out of it. So it must be the case that if I attack, G minus X must be is not connected. Okay, and a separator, okay, is this cut. Okay, it's a set of nodes that are removed which disconnects the network. And you want to look at the cheapest separator, so you look at the minimal. And in fact, you want to look at so you want to look at separators that are affordable. Okay, so now if you start with a network, you're going to have a set of separators, and if you want to defend the network, you've got to block these separators. Okay, so you basically have a hypergraph which is induced by the set of separators, and so let me make this a little more concrete by looking at a picture. So here's a network, very simple tree network, and the set of separators are all these guys, other than the leaves. All of them are separators. And this is a simple case where singleton nodes are separators. So there are 5 separators, and if you want to preserve the connectivity of the network, you've got to protect all 5 of them. And so this is the set of the nodes that you have to protect to maintain the connectivity of the network.
So if you take out all the nodes, it's okay?
Yeah, that's why I said it's a little odd. Yeah, that's why I was saying it's a little odd. Okay, but we'll build on. So the idea I want to get across here is the separators and transversal. Transversal is the cardinality of the of the hypergraph. Okay, so here's another example. This is a core periphery network, and if you want to separate the network, you've got to knock out one of the core nodes, and each of them constitutes a separator. And to protect the network, you've got to protect all 4 of them, because if you protect only 3, for instance, then this node can separate, fragment the network. Okay, so that's the minimum transversal. And finally, you have another example, which is a little more richer. So here you have the CD is one separator, C, E, and F is another separator. B by itself is a separator, A is a separator. And then if you want to make sure that you protect the network, you've got to protect A, B, and C. Otherwise, so that's the minimum transversal.
So the cost is in terms of the number of separators,
Yes.
number of nodes involved?
Number of nodes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the very simple idea. So what's going on here is you have the phi function. You have a network G, you have the phi function, and you have the cost of attack and defense. Okay, and now you want to ask what are the nodes you want to protect, what are the nodes you want to attack. In this simple setting, you have, this picture is, I'll come back to this picture, but this is a very, very simple, very obvious sort of result. And I'm going to use this to study the London Underground. Okay, so it's basically saying that you will have attacks. If you can defend the network, this is the minimum transversal times the cost of defense. If it's affordable, you can defend it, then you will defend it. And once it's defended, there's no attack, because once you have a transversal in place, protected, the separators are not effective anymore, and therefore there's no attack. So that's why you have the empty set. And otherwise, you have some attack. So let's just look at, to get a sense of what this is doing, let me look at so I have two applications, but I'll go through the London Underground. Okay, and so what's happening here is that London Underground it has these stations and it has these links, and this is how it looks. Okay. So these are the different stations, and you have these branch lines going off into the suburbs. That's how it looks. And we want to understand if you have some cost of attacking and you have some cost of defending, what's going to be the nature of, who should you protect, how much defense is needed, and so on. Okay, and how does it depend on the cost of defense and attack?
But Sanjeev,
Yes.
It seems that for this application and for many others, I would say, the natural objective function should be how much you disrupt the flow. So, for example, if there is just by attacking a node, you just isolate a small fraction of it, then that should not be that bad. But if you really
Or if you require people to take a bus from the station on either side.
bus from,
So if you disrupt this node and then you just take a bus from this station to that station, and so
yeah,
it's some disruption that you have to. This 0-1 thing is obviously
yeah, yes, I think it's a bit
extreme, but let's see what it says.
Yeah, no, I think so. So as I said, it's a way to just get some idea about how these networks and how the defense attack problem works in these kinds of settings. And then I will, of course, move on to a value function which is much more general.
Okay, you will move.
Yeah,
So this is just illustration.
Yes,
Okay,
that's
okay,
right.
okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. So, just to build some intuition.
We're not making actual decisions based on this one.
What?
Well, that's another question.
Okay, so it has 309 nodes, and it has just 370 links, which is a very sparse network. Okay, it's actually staggeringly sparse, if you think about it. And and it has, and we're going to look at separators of size 6, at most 6. Okay, so you can have separators of size 1, 2. You can see here, if I take this link out, I separate the network. There is no doubt. So it's a very trivial way of separating the network. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll look at larger separators also, and so I'll look at separators of most which contain 6 nodes. So there are 6,000 such separators, and this is the distribution of the separators. Okay, so what is this? What is this saying? This histogram is saying there are roughly 150 singleton separators, and most of the separators are actually have 6 nodes. Okay, so now if you want to, what we want to do is we want to understand how the defense depends on the cost of defense and attack. Okay, so let's try and do this picture gives you an idea about, really we want to understand, supposing the costs of attack are changing, okay, how much does it take to defend this network? Yes.
Just to clarify, if you have a size 6 separator, that means that if you took out 5 of these 6, then the network would still be connected.
That's right. Yeah, that's what it means. Yeah. So what's going on here, and this is the, I think it's an interesting feature of this example, is that if you, on the x-axis I have the cost of attack, and so the larger the cost of attack, the smaller the set of separators that I can hope to use. Okay. And so anything above half means that I will, I can't use, I'll just have a singleton separator. And if I have between half and 1/3, I can use 2-node separators. And when I go from 1/6 onwards, then, I can use up to 7 separators, six separators. Okay, so what's going on here is that if you have singleton separators, then you need 135 nodes protected. Okay, that's the transversal number. But as you lower the cost of attack all the way down, to 1/7, you see that the transversal number grows, but it doesn't grow massively. Okay, so in other words, a very sharp fall in costs doesn't have such a huge impact on the cost of defending the network.
But the objective, if you have just one separator left that you have not defended, the payoffs are the same, no? As if you have, if I understood correctly.
That's right. Yeah, that is why.
So-
Yes.
So then, in that
Yes.
sense, you would either just be able, I mean, from the point of view of the decision maker, he would just be ready to, if possible, to defend all these guys, or just no.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. But the question is, how many should you defend to make sure the network is connected? And that's the answer is given here. So, for instance, if your costs are between 1/6 and 1/7, the cost of attack, then you need to defend 205 nodes. And once you've defended these 205 nodes, you are sure that no attack can disconnect the network. This is the minimum number you need. Okay. So you get a similar picture if you look at it's a little more interesting, but again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's more to build some idea about this is a rather different looking network. This is the US airport network, and you can see it's a very dense network relatively, okay, compared to the London Underground. And that makes sense because, this is flights, whereas that one is, physical infrastructure. So you would expect something like this. Anyway, so what you see here is a very similar kind of structure that as the cost of defense attack fall, the transversal number grows, but actually doesn't grow very much.
So this one doesn't make sense for a different reason.
Sure.
We can reset the links
Totally. Yes.
immediately.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's
Yes.
if
Yes, I mean, the point is,
if 2 nodes have become disconnected, run a flight there.
exactly, yeah, you just reroute the flight.
Yeah, it's you don't have to dig a new tube.
Right. Okay, so, but what I want to do is what I would like you to take away from this discussion, which, your points are sort of well taken, but I want to get across the idea of these parameters, the costs of defense and attack, the network which is given, and when you think about value of the network, and I'll now talk about more general value functions, how somehow, as you vary the parameters, the graph structure comes into play. Okay, and it comes into play in interesting ways, and we have to look at notions of separators and transversals, okay, of the hypergraph of separators. And so what I want you to do is to keep those in mind, and now we move to the more general problem, okay. So the value of the network is now, is component additive. So each component, there's a value, and it's increasing in convex in the size of the component. Okay, so it's significantly more general than, and now we can work with this, and this is a fairly general model. It's still not quite as general as one would like, because we would like to have some notion of distance in the network. Here, distance is not an issue. So how far apart nodes are is not an issue. As long as they're connected, we are happy with it. Okay, so that's the major, I think, restriction and major limitation of this model.
Okay, I don't understand this. What does this mean exactly?
So,
The function?
okay, so supposing you have a network G, what's the value of this network? The value of this network is So I look at this network. So supposing the network looks like this. This is an example. So there are 6 nodes, and there are 8 nodes in all. So what's the value of this network? It's the sum of the value of each of these components. There are 4 components, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I have to sum up those values. And what's the value of this component? It's simply, it's just the it's a function of the number of nodes in the component. And it's increasing in convex. So an example would be the function, for example, x squared. That's a very simple example of a component value. Okay, so now, for example, in this network, you would have 3 squared plus 3 squared plus 1 plus 1. That would be the value of the network. So this, I think, captures some of what Fernando was saying, that I'm concerned about, how connected this thing is, not just whether it's connected or it's not connected.
But you're only concerned about whether it's connected. You don't care if you have to change subways 18 times.
That's what I was saying. Yes, exactly. Yes, so that's the major limitation of this model, that it is only concerned about the size of the component. It's not concerned about other features that you may be.
Okay, I didn't know what you meant by size. Now I see.
Yeah. Okay, so what happens now is
Logging off. Oh dear. Installing updates for you. They know that people at Microsoft know what you want. They're doing it for you.
okay.
You're not smart.
All right, so let me
Decide.
spend a few minutes just talking through what happens now. So one of the things there are a number of things that now come up. First of all, now I don't care only about whether something is connected or not connected, because if I fragment the thing into smaller components, then I reduce the value. But I may want to not only just reduce, fragment the network, I may just want to also reduce the size of the component, because that lowers the value of the component. So the problem becomes a lot richer. Okay. And let's see if it's going to start, but because there's a slide which summarizes some of the ideas.
It's not a restart, it's shut down.
It's saying starting Windows. Okay, so let me say a few words about what sorts of results we have. This is work in progress, and so I'm going to walk you through a few results. So one of the things that we find is that we can use the idea of separators and hypergraphs and transversal to characterize the optimal attacks and optimal defense in the general case. Okay, so we don't have a complete characterization of equilibrium, but we have a partial characterization of the optimal defense and attack, and it exploits these ideas, transversals and the separators and so on. So that's one general result we have. But then we want to understand properties.
Sorry, what's your notion of equilibrium? Is an equilibrium, is there always attack in equilibrium?
Right, so I was going to come to that. So you can, of course, see that formally an equilibrium here is a sub-imperfect equilibrium of this game. Now you're asking me what properties does this sub-imperfect equilibrium have? And
ideally you'd have an equilibrium when attack never happens, and no trade kind of equilibrium.
Right, so from the defender's point of view. So, this is going to take time.
It's too expensive.
Exactly, yeah. So the answer, the exact nature of the equilibrium is
And
going to
then the
depend.
attack happens for sure, so you want to have limiting cases. Like you choose not to defend, or you fortify in a way that the attack never happens.
Right, so that's going to depend on, so it may be, if the cost of defense are very large, that it may be optimal to let go of part of the network. Whereas if costs of attack are very large, it may be optimal not to attack. So really the interest is, as you I think rightly said, it's going to be what's the nature of the equilibrium and how does the equilibrium vary with the cost of defense and attack and the network that you're starting with. Those are the three parameters. Okay.
So if we had another stage where it's costly to set up the network, presumably you wouldn't set up any node that you know is going to be attacked in equilibrium.
Yes, so
Since these are all pure strategies, right?
sure. So let me forget about the computer and just talk more generally. Yes. So I'll come to your point in a moment. So the idea is you characterize equilibria, the general value function case, and then you ask how do properties of equilibrium, what are the properties we are interested in? Properties that we're interested in is whether there is attack, whether there is defense, what are the nodes that are attacked? Can you characterize them using some graph theoretic properties? We know that there should be separators, but we also know that sometimes you may want to target non-separators in the general value function case. Can you say something more? Okay, what are the key nodes to attack and defend? So the characterization result, okay, it's still configured. The characterization result essentially gives you a handle on that, and it maps the parameters. And so one of the key things that we are interested in is the amount of resources that are spent in conflict. Okay, how much defense money do you spend? How much attack do you spend? You may be interested in knowing what is the defender's residual equilibrium payoff. So you might, for instance, wonder if the cost of attack go up, is it always a good thing for the defender? Right? One would think intuitively it should always be good, but an attack becomes more costly. So those kinds of properties, you might think that when you make the network denser, if you add links, it should always increase the value of the defender. It should always increase the equilibrium payoff of the defender. And it should always lower the equilibrium payoff of the adversary. Is that true? So what we have is, let's see, can I, yeah. It went off on its own.
It installed new operating system things or something. And then it rebooted twice and configured things twice.
Okay, so there are a number of results, and I'll keep it very brief, but so let me go back to the London Underground. Okay, so what happens for large costs of attacks is that you're only going to attack if you're going to fragment the network substantially. It's not worth your while to take 3 nodes out because the costs of attack are very large. Okay, so the way I defend the network is I protect all the core nodes. But for small costs of attack, all manner of nodes could be attacked. And if I want to defend the network, I'll have to protect the core nodes, and in addition, I'll have to go and protect many of the branch nodes. Okay, so you get a much smoother result. And as I said, a major something we are working on now is a question which is, I think, quite a nice general question. If I have a network, if I look at 2 networks, one of the questions I would be interested in is one network much more likely to create conflict? Are some structures such that they are much more vulnerable, okay, or create much more conflict compared to other networks? Okay. And it turns out that one might think that when you take a network and you add links, you must make attack much less attractive because somehow you're making it much more resilient. And those simple sort of comparative static properties, it's not easy to establish those, so it's sort of ongoing work. The total amount of attack and defense that's in equilibrium, how it varies with the network, That's the kind of problem we are trying to study.
And what is the value function in this case?
Oh, this is the general case that I was talking about. This is the
So,
component additive convex value function. Okay, so I have about 15 minutes and I really
No,
want
you
to.
have more. You started at 2:15. I mean, at least I don't have any.
Okay,
But if you want to.
Yeah.
Maybe
maybe I'll go on till 3:05. Okay. So the question you were asking was what happens if I take a step back and I look at the network formation problem instead of taking the network as given. Okay, so what I'll be talking about now is actually the network formation problem, but I'll make the problem richer by allowing for attacks to spread through the network. Okay, so I'll talk about that setting, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention to you, we have a paper which came out in a journal a few years ago, which looks at the network formation and defense problem, the joint problem, in the earlier model where there is no spread of attack. Okay. But let me now move on to I find this much more interesting problem. Certainly, there's more. You will see in a moment. There's a lot more happening in this model where there's again a defender and an adversary, but now the defender can choose the network and has some resources to defend the network. Okay. The adversary sees the network and sees the defense pattern and then attacks the network. Okay. Again, the goal is to minimize the value of the residual network, and the key difference from the earlier work is now there's contagion. Okay. So let me show you a picture to give you an idea of how it works. So you have this hub-spoke network, and you have the designer who's assigned 4 units to defend the center. You have the adversary in red who's attacking 4 peripheral nodes which are undefended. So since they're undefended and they're being attacked, they are taken over, they are captured. And it's like a computer system, it's been captured by a botnet herder, and now it's a slave of this guy. And so it now launches attacks on the hub node. Okay. And so there's conflict now, the hub node. And so it's important to understand what is the technology of conflict. And so in economics, there's a standard model of conflict, the Tulloch contest function, which specifies, depending on the resources in conflict, the probability who wins. Okay, so in this case, it's a very simple case where there are 4 units of defense, 4 units of attack. When they attack the center, they are equally matched, so there's a probability half that the defense prevails. In that case, 4 peripheral nodes have been captured, but the rest of the network is safe. With probability half, the attack is successful, the hub is captured, and then the rest of the network is captured indirectly because they're all undefended nodes. Okay. So this is how the model. Let me show you another picture. Okay, so here's a slightly more complicated setting, but I'm just trying to give you a feel of the model.
But then there is, in this conflict game, there are resources also expended in it, no? The Tulloch game, you have resources that are costly in prevailing, no?
Yes, so
There are two types of costs. There, no? One in forming the network, defending the network, fighting against the intruder. There are 3 types of costs.
right. Okay, so the way this model works is you're right, but the resources are given exogenously. Okay, so there is no cost of resources. You have some resources. I mean, so it's a budget. Okay. Now, of course, I can make these things, sufficiently. So there's a fixed set of resources that I'm allocating there, and I'm also deciding the network. I'm choosing the network. So here's another network, same set of resources, and you see that I'm defending 2 central nodes, and the adversary is targeting 4 peripheral nodes, and then mounting an attack on the hub nodes. And you see that the probability 1/4. Okay, so let me walk you through this picture because I think it'll give you some idea of the dynamics. So what happens is, this is the simplest case. The attacks are mounted on the 2 respective hubs and they fail. okay, and they fail with probability half on each of these nodes because there are 2 units of defense and 2 units of attack that are launching the attack. So there's a probability half that it's successfully defended, and that's true for each of them, and it's independent. So there's a probability 1/4 that only the 4 peripheral nodes are captured. Okay, and the mirror image of that is that both the hubs are captured, and then of course indirectly, once they are captured, the attack then takes over the remaining part of the undefended network. That's what happens at the top. Okay, the middle bit is the complicated bit where one hub is knocked out, the other is not knocked out. Well, so in this case, the left hub is knocked out, the right hub survives the attack, but then it's vulnerable to a further attack from the captured hub. Okay, and then either it survives that attack, in that case you come here, or it fails the attack, in which case you go up. Okay, so that's the way the model works. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's the so you set up a network, you set up your defense allocation, the adversary attacks, and then you have these dynamics taking place. And because the dynamics are the way I'm going to be a little more formal in a moment, but roughly speaking, the dynamics are such that at every period, some resources are being used up. So in other words, it's a finite problem. It's a finite problem. You're going to have either everything is captured, or everything is or the attack resources are used up. So you have a limiting network. And so you want to look at the distribution on these surviving networks, and you want to work backwards from that and look at what is the best for the designer, what is the best network come defense in some sense, which sort of maximizes the value of the residual network distribution. So as before, the value of the network is this component additive convex function. Okay, F is a convex function. Conflict is modeled as a Tulloch contest. If the designer allocates X, the adversary allocates Y, the probability of successful attack is Y raised to the power M divided by X raised to the power M. That's Y raised to the power M. This is a standard Tulloch contest function, and M is called in this literature, which is a very mature literature. Jack Hirschleifer coined this word M as the technology of conflict. That's literature. Okay, and we will see that it has some nice properties. Okay, M is going to play a role. And finally, once you have this conflict and you are successful either in defending or in attacking, then you take over the opponent resources. So if you're the adversary and you have beaten me on a node, well, my defense resources are eliminated on that node. Okay, and if you are the adversary and I have beaten you, then your adversary resources are eliminated. Okay, that's the simplifying assumption. And as the pictures illustrated, once you've captured a node, you automatically capture all the neighboring nodes that are undefended, and you go all the way till you hit a defended node, and then you have another contest, which is a Tulloch contest. So that's the dynamics.
So if everything boils down to the cost structure on both sides, right? Everything reduces down to the cost structure. Given, since the network is given, let's say the network is given, and the value functions are given, everything goes down to the cost of defense and attack. Is there something strange about them where you can have something interesting where it's not just like sort of like if I have more money to allocate and you have less money to allocate, I'm going to be more likely to end it. Is there some strange outcome? Is there a way to divide up these costs into sort of sub-costs where you could have situations which are unusual, like, Grossman-Stiglitz kind of situations, no attack, even though with minimal cost, no attack ever happens. So there's slight perturbation in cost. All of a sudden, everything just sort of changes.
Yeah, so you'll see the results are very stark. but I think maybe I have not been clear. There are no costs of defense and attack here. So basically, there's a budget that's given to you of defense and attack resources. And the network is a key variable, choice variable here. The network is not given. So I've moved to a model now where the network is a choice variable. So I think you are still thinking about the previous model.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so here, the defender is choosing the network and choosing how to allocate his defense resources. And I think the question that you're asking, I can rephrase it as what happens as I vary the budgets of defense and attack, which is another way of thinking about cost of defense and attack. In this model, that's how it will turn out. If you have a lot more defense compared to my attack resources, how does the design problem change?
Right, so
Yes.
let's say.
And I'll have an answer, I'll have a results on that.
The design problem, but the interesting part of it, if the costs of design of attack and defense are fairly close to each other, then is there a slight change in the cost which would make a particular choice of network to be starkly different from the ones that, there's sort of a non-linearity in the outcome. The
So-
linear cases are just sort of become obvious, right?
So I don't think there's anything obvious about this result.
There's nothing.
So I think you should wait and see. And if you still have those questions, your questions are serious, but they're very different from the model that I'm looking at. So I think you should just wait for 2 minutes, and then we can come back to your questions. Your questions are more relevant for the model I did earlier. And as I said to you, that I think it's a very legitimate question. How does the relative costs of the adversary and the defender, how do they matter? Okay, in this model, that's reflected in the relative budgets of defense and attack resources. And I will talk about that when I present the theorem, so I think you should just wait and see.
Excuse me,
Yes.
another question. And what happens if unprotected node is connected to two protected nodes and one of them fails and another doesn't? So
I'm sorry?
if unprotected nodes is connected to two protected nodes.
That's right,
and
yes.
One,
Yeah, then it's captured.
then it's still captured.
Yes.
One fails.
So that's the reason why you'll see that will turn up in the proof, actually, of the result. That's a good point. Okay, so what's going to happen is that you set up this network and you set up the defense and there's an attack, there's a dynamics, and at the end you're going to get some networks that will survive, and those networks are given, for any network that survives, which will be a subset of the original network that you started with, you will get some value, pi of g prime, and you want to work with the expected, because there's a probability that that network arises, and that probability is given by this expression p of g prime, given the network, the defense and attack resources, and the dynamics, okay, of conflict. So that's the probability distribution on residual networks, and you want to maximize this, okay, basically this object as a defender. And your question is really about how, this value and the optimal graph, etc. This graph, is going to vary depending on the D and A.
So I guess the timing matters, but you're just assuming everything happens as quickly as possible. So if we have a node over here that's kind of difficult to attack, and a node over there that's easier, then you'd really like to have your 2 units over here wait until this one is captured,
Sure.
and they can all gang up.
Sure.
But they don't. They attack immediately.
You're right, that's the way the model is set up. In the paper, we actually have a very long discussion on how those sort of details don't matter for many variations can be accommodated within the argument we have here. And you will see in a moment, once you see the result, why somehow, things that might appear ex ante to be very important, why they will not be once you see the result. I mean, part of the result, at least it will not matter. Okay, so this is one part of the, a large part of the paper. This is the theorem. And what is the theorem saying? So remember, A is the attack resources, D is the defense resources. Okay, so we're going to look at first the case where you know, A is larger. Okay, so another way to put it is that it's cheaper to attack than to defend. That would be another way to put this. Okay. So what happens then is that you get a very crisp result. I'm first looking at connected networks. I'm assuming that you are in the class of connected networks. Okay, so let's just restrict ourselves to that class. Within that class, what should the architecture of the network be? Well, if the adversary's resources are larger than the defense resources, then it's optimal to have a simple core periphery network and to put all your defense resources on the central node. Okay, so that's the result. If, on the other hand, A is smaller than D, so the defender has more resources, then you can have richer structures emerging in equilibrium being optimal, a protected core of hubs. So you can have multiple hubs. And in particular, gamma here refers to the technology of conflict. You may actually want to have lots of core nodes, okay, when the technology, because it's a way to drag on the conflict. And when gamma is small, what does it say? It sort of says that if you have a lot of attack resources and you're coming at me, well, it doesn't matter. Gamma is small, so I'm going to be as good as you are. Resource size doesn't matter. Okay, that's what really the idea of this conflict function is, right? So when M is very large, okay, if Y is larger than X, it will win for sure. But when M is close to 0, then the size of X and Y don't matter. The probability of winning is roughly half. Okay, so that's the role, that's the way in which the technology of conflict interacts with the X and Y, and that's why it's going to come into play here. Okay, you know, I'm going to be out of time, but let me just make sure that you see what the result is. Okay, so this is how resources come into play, and it's not as sharp as maybe what you were looking for, that if I change from A greater than D to A slightly smaller than D, I might completely change, you know, the architecture. But there is some of that flavor here. Instead of having a single hub, and I'll show you that, you know, the single hub is optimal for a very wide variety of cases. When you go from A greater than D to A smaller than D, you may actually land up having multiple hubs. So a very different network might emerge as being optimal. And this final line is about when is a connected network optimal, and this has to do with how convex the component value function is. If it's very convex, then you have pressure towards connectivity. You know, and you can see, if you think about the problem, that there's a trade-off. Sometimes when you break up the network into smaller bits, the adversary can't attack all bits. So you actually get left, you could get left with many more nodes, but they are fragmented. In fact, in the limiting case, you know, many more nodes will survive. So it depends on how convex the problem is. Okay, the more convex the problem is, the more there's pressure towards connectivity. And in particular, you can prove when it's exponential, then you will get connected networks as optimal. Okay. So the shape of F also matters. So what I've done here is I've given you a result which maps the different ingredients of this problem: the defense attack resources, the technology of conflict, and the value function. Okay, it sort of. Okay, so let me give you some intuition as to why, in the case A is greater than or equal to D, why you want to have a single hub rather than multiple hubs, okay, rather than a more decentralized, spread out network. So we'll look at a case where you have, I think you have 12 nodes. And so this is the simple case we looked at earlier. You have probability half of 8 nodes surviving connected and probability half of nothing surviving. So you have extremal outcomes. And let's look at this case. What's going on here is that now I have not a single hub, but 2 hubs. And so I'm splitting the defense. And what I want to do is to show you how the convexity of the component value function is key to understanding why you prefer this outcome, this bang-bang outcome, to this, what might appear to be a more attractive way of doing things, which is to have a spread out network with two hubs, both hubs protected. So what happens when you do that is, as you can see, this is the support of the limiting distribution. And if you look at it and you do some simple computations, you will see that the number of nodes that survive, the mean number of nodes, is the same in this case and in this case. Okay. What is different is that this distribution is much smoother. In particular, it has this case where part of the network is captured, but part of the network is intact. This is missing in this bang-bang solution. Now, since f is convex, you don't want smooth outcomes. You want bang-bang outcomes. So formally, this distribution stochastically dominates this distribution. Okay, and since f is convex, you want the more extreme distribution. Okay, that's the result. Okay, so that gives you a handle on it. It doesn't go all the way because it's this part of this is the key. That single hubs are better than multiple hubs. The rest of the proof is really to show, I think the point you were making, that I don't want to have protected hubs and unprotected hubs in the middle, because then I'm exposing them to both of these guys. So I want to move unprotected hubs out and put them in connection with just one single hub, protected hub. So that, in other words, I want to have co-periphery networks. But then when I have co-periphery networks, I'm making this comparison between co-periphery and a single hub case, so singleton core. And that's the argument I was doing and I was making to you. And so this is the crux of the proof of the first part. Okay, now it turns out it's a little more subtle what happens when A is smaller than D, but very simply the idea is that if I'm disadvantaged in terms of resources, I can use a network to slow down, and gamma is very small, so this technology of conflict is saying resources don't matter. So what I can do is I can just spread the network and have little bits of defense sitting on many nodes. Now, if you want to take over the network, you go to come and attack one by one and take over. You may be coming with lots of attack, but every time you attack me, I have almost half probability of surviving the attack. Okay, so it's in my interest not to have this bang bang sort of thing. Okay, that's the idea.
This is about a full-fledged dynamic context. No?
Yes.
The comment that you're making,
Yes.
that is not in the model.
It is in the model. So the model actually has dynamics of conflict.
Dynamics going indefinite over time.
Yes, but the way the model is set up, at every point you have elimination of resources. So you have a finite.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to therefore also distribute the resources over time. That's also part of your strategy.
So let me just be I mean, formally this is not, it's not the case that what I've done is that I have actually specified some rules how you allocate resources dynamically. So it's not that I'm doing dynamic optimization with the allocation of resources. Is that the question you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, so there is no dynamic optimization. It's not the case that once I am in a state where there's some bits of the network chopped off, there's some captured nodes, some undefended nodes, and then I'm optimizing. How do I allocate my resources? I'm not doing that. What I'm doing here is, once I'm in that state, there is a process at work. There is no player who's active.
It's just a rule, a certain rule.
There's a set of rules at work. Okay, and yes, those are the rules at work. And so that, in that sense, there are dynamics, and in that sense, you're looking at the distribution of the limiting networks.
I think these results could flip if you change the structure a little bit, and I don't know if you thought of the structure. The structure is, suppose you have a budget, you're a defender, but you can spend your budget not just on defending, you can also spend your budget on recovery of already captured nodes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, some of your nodes are captured, but you can spend your budget on recovering,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can reboot parts of your system. And so if that is the case, then you may not want to go with a star. You may actually have a distributed structure. You may want to have a protected core, and then parts of it that gets captured, you recapture it. So you stay within the protected core by spending your resources that way pretty much all the time. You never want to get to a star.
You
Even
could
if your
possibly have
resources-
cycles, because you get attacks going around.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that, I see, I think what you're getting at, but it's important to bear in mind that even within this setting, it's not always the case that you want to have a single hub spoke network.
Right.
So you don't have to go outside this framework, to get richer structures or, disconnected networks. But I agree with you that you may want to have a richer dynamic model where it's a little crude what we have done here. So I fight with you and I lose. Once I lose, I can never recover.
Recapture.
Whereas
In
I think
reality, you can, right?
Sorry.
In reality, you can. So a standard example is, financial institutions need to have a complete backup of their systems. So even if part of them is captured, they shut it down and back up an exact replica somewhere in New
Right,
Jersey.
right,
Okay?
right.
So you've captured it, but I just recovered the replica. So whatever it is that you're doing, spending the cost on doing that, I spend my cost on recovering the replica of whatever you've captured, right? So if I can spend resources not just on defending, but also on recovering, then I would be considering situations that are quite a bit different.
It's not obvious to me that you may not want to have half of your resources on defending and half on recovering on the hub.
It's not obvious at all, but I would not necessarily then settle on hub and spoke, even if the attacker's resources are massive. So I'll just have a shadow system that basically attacks, like 2 hubs and spokes. Well, anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So the other thing that's not in this theorem is, of course, that this F here is convex, whereas in many settings, a lot of the value of the network can be appropriated with just half the network. So if you don't have convexity all the way, but you have convexity with half the network and then it becomes concave, then of course you get immediately multiple hubs. So there are many ways in which you can get, so it's just a way of thinking about the problem and thinking about some of the trade-offs. Okay. So I'm really out of time, but I thought I'd give you a flavor of how does one think about key nodes for attack and defense in a conflictual situation. And then having thought about that, think about design in a conflict setting. And relative to the work, there is now, of course, a lot of interest in computer science in these kinds of problems, but it's a very recent, I would say there's a lot of ongoing work now on trying to understand these problems. And as I said at the outset, I've assumed that defense is centralized, but in fact, in many applications, defense is decentralized. And one of the problems you may have is that the center may not have enough incentives to protect itself because of externality. So you may want to decentralize the network for security reasons. And so some of the work we have done is on those kinds of questions. What happens? What's the optimal design when defense is decentralized? Okay, so I think I'll stop and I can take maybe one question, and otherwise I'll maybe stop.
Many of the issues that you address here appear as well when one discusses financial networks.
Mm-hmm.
Except that typically in financial networks, one doesn't have this sort of party that has opposing interests, but one thinks of nature as having just having some random strategy.
Right.
Could you adapt your analysis to a contender that has a mixed strategy?
Yeah, so so as I said at the outset, you can actually think of this problem as looking at the worst case scenario. There's some agent out there, and you don't know what this agent is doing, but you want to look at the worst case scenario. In other words, the agent is trying to minimize your payoffs. It could be nature. So this exercise could be thought of simply maximizing the minimum, the worst case. Right? Yeah. So in that sense, it's not. On the other hand, it turns out that when you're looking at, so let me leave you with this thought, which I mean I find very, it's quite intriguing. So what happens in one thing that really there's a random attack nature versus strategic attack. One thing where it really matters is in the following sort of. It matters in the very following way. So supposing I can see the defense, okay, I can see there is a bunch of you, and I can see that you have defended yourself. It's like a theft alarm, a burglar alarm. So what happens then is if you've defended yourself very, very much compared to someone else, and you're equally attractive as targets, I'm going to attack the least protected one. So this creates actually a negative externality from defense, which is kind of makes sense in these adversarial situations. So now what happens is that this is the opposite of the traditional vaccination problem. In the traditional vaccination problem, when I vaccinate, I don't take into account the goods I bring to you because I'm not going to fall sick, so you don't fall sick. So this is the under-provision problem. Okay, but in the security setting, you can have the opposite, over-provision problem. Okay. So now when you now step back and you think about the over-provision problem, what happens is in the optimal design case, you want to lower the incentives of people to protect themselves, okay, because they're doing too much protection. And you do that by fragmenting the network, by essentially offering part of the network as a decoy to the adversary. And you give enough of it that the adversary attacks that, and the residual network now realizes that there isn't, this threat, so they don't overprotect themselves. Okay, if you put the network together, there's too much incentive to divert attack. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, when you have a random attack, this is not a problem anymore. The problem is actually people don't protect themselves enough because there's this traditional under-provision of vaccination problem. So when you have random attack, you want to create incentives for people to protect themselves, and the way you do that is that you overexpose them to threats. So you make the network very dense, more dense than the first best. So that's the sense in which when you go from strategic attack to random attack, in one case you fragment the network relative to the first best. In the other case, you make the network more dense. You expose it to more danger. And that's the only way in which you can get people to protect themselves. Okay, so that's a subtlety about how these things comes into.
I think a lot of attacks come from within the network.
Yeah, so you raised this
So
question.
yes. So, for example, in the case of long-term capital markets, when they start having trouble with some of their bets, like they had the bets on the ruble-denominated bonds versus dollar-denominated bonds that Russia had issued, and they said, "Oh, it's a sovereign debt; it's the same credit, so the rates should be the same once you account for the exchange rate." And but it was wrong because there's no priority in sovereign debt, and that Russia said we're going to destroy our access to international markets if we default on the dollar-denominated debt. So they just default on the ruble-denominated debt, which is exactly what long-term capital had bet against. So they made some bets like this that didn't work out. And once they made those bets and were in some trouble, then some of their counterparties, who were part of the network that they operated in, changed the terms of trade on them. They say, we don't like you as well now, and now your margin requirement is twice as big, knowing that putting them into distress would cause prices to change in a way that's favorable to them. Another example of this is in electrical networks is that transmission, you talk about attacks on nodes, there's also attacks on links. And one of the things that you have in electrical networks is you have ownership of transmission capacity. And in some of these networks, there's a very highly developed pricing scheme as a function of time and location for how much you pay for electricity. That's some kind of an equilibrium that comes out. There are certainly cases that at least there are good stories which sound like they're true, where a company has decided to do maintenance on some transmission facility exactly when that's going to allow them to get a very high price for their output in one of their producing capacities. And so this is an attack on the network that's coming from, in both cases, coming from a participant.
Yeah, so I think there is, I just wanted to, I'm going to stop now, but I just wanted to say that there is actually a set of models, and there's ongoing work on exactly, well, not maybe, the models you're referring to, but not the context you're referring to, but this idea that you have network mediated conflict. You have, the simplest case is kingdoms which are fighting with each other. And when you take over, I fight with you and I lose, then you take me over, you take over my resources, and then you fight with my neighbors, and you expand or you shrink. And you will look at the dynamics of conflict and dynamics of empires, if you like. So there's, work on that sort of thing, and there's a reasonable community of people working on those kinds of things, which is slightly different from the finance setting, because I think there's this prices stuff going on in the background here, which is where I think a lot of I personally think that those are very interesting things, and but I'll stop and let Fernando come on. And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.